The pattern of Christianity that I follow, and particularly in the Episcopal tradition, that involves ministry with other people. So I'm not a solo practitioner of Christianity. I have a whole bunch of people reminding me the way we do it. And for me, I think that's good because it helps me carry out the ministry of Jesus in community. So a model we use in the Diocese of Spokane and in the College for Congregational Development for understanding the purpose of a congregation is a model called Gather, Transform, Send. I'm just curious about how many people have heard this language before in the room. That I had a hunch that was the case. So if this is new material to you, I think it's pretty intuitive, and we have a lot of people around you who can help orient you to this material as we talk about it. So I think everyone has a handout that comes from the manual for the College of Congregational Development. You can follow along in your manual. So the idea of this model is to help us think about stuff we do, like our congregation, in a way that helps us understand it better so we can work on it. It's a way of seeing the way we live together and work together so that we can understand it more deeply, have the power to change it if it needs to change or be adapted. Right? Just gives us a way to think about it and work on it. So in this model, the primary things that a congregation does are gather folks into community, create space for God's transformative work to happen. So it goes like this. First, we gather folks. Help God gather them. And then we create spaces where, in practices, cultivate that so that God can transform those folks and us. And then we send these folks out into the world. And actually, they go into what we call a context, right? So when you leave church, where do you immediately go after?
Brunch.
Coffee house brunch, right? So in theory, if we did our job here, you would be a better Christian at brunch than you would have otherwise been. So maybe typically, right? So, but you're sent into this context, and the funny thing is then later, hopefully next week or a couple days later or whenever it's time and you need that help, you are regathered. So when we gather folks, there's 4 ways we accomplish this well. So if we really want people to be in a space where they can be transformed, the 4 things we do are we invite people to come. Like they have to know that there's a thing. And if no one says, hey, pay attention to this, then they don't show up. So we invite people to become a part of our gathering, our community. When they arrive, we greet them. We notice they exist. In the liturgy, the part of this is the peace. It's actually what it's not to catch up with our friends, although that's a fun thing sometimes we do. The purpose of the peace in the liturgy is to acknowledge the divine spirit within the other person. We came to do this together, right? To make sure we're reconciled. We greet one another. We orient people to the way we do things. That might be as simple as where you go to the bathroom. But it also might be, which book is that you're juggling? Or why are you doing this weird thing with your hands? And we incorporate people. We say, you can be a part of this body. With us. So that involves teaching, transmission of culture, incorporation.
With Orient and Incorporate, the ones that I have seen that have been really effective are places where we're paying a lot of attention to who's been doing what historically, and we're paying a lot of attention to who hasn't yet been touched and invited to be part of things inside the church. And we recognize we have some gaps in people's knowledge about how to get involved here and how then to become knit into this community. And it's as simple, one of them was as simple as Post-it notes with every single name of every single visitor and member that they had seen in the last 3 months, and identifying how many things each one of them was involved in and who they needed to reach out to and invite to either educational programs about the Episcopal Church or ways of being involved in ministry. And then 3 people making those personal contacts and drawing people in along with some Episcopal 101 kinds of things.
So in those examples, folks were gathered because they knew what was going on. People acknowledged them when they showed up. And then there was intentional planning around these different steps. Like, how are we going to invite? Is there somebody there to greet? How are we orienting and incorporating once people show up so that they can be transformed? So one way we incorporate people is baptism. I was baptized the week after I turned 21 at Christ Church, Seattle in the University District. And it wasn't that much longer after that I went away to seminary. But what I learned there as a new Christian, because it was a community where there were a lot of smarty pants, because we were right next to a university. And I'm sure some of you know what this is like. And it was also, so there was a lot of very intelligent people, and also a lot of people have been wounded by the institutional church or academia, I noticed. There was a lot of weirdos at that church. There were a lot of elders. In fact, this was the last holdout that had a 1928 service, like 10 years ago, in the chapel that ran concurrent to the primary liturgy. Yeah. Crazy, right? It was the first time I'd been in a community where people lived and ate and prayed together, and then some of them died. Like, I'd actually not had a lot of experience with that as a young person. And even though I knew a lot of people who had seen a lot of traumatic things who were refugees, or I knew people who died of AIDS, but I hadn't lived and prayed with people in a community, like a family like that, like a household. And so I saw people for the first time as a young adult in all the developmental stages trying to be good, the way that Jesus taught us to be good, what we thought that meant. And it turned out later, when I would have a kind of moment where I was confronted with my own mortality. I was a victim of an armed home invasion robbery, and there was a gun, like literally a gun to my head. It turns out I mixed up the words to the Lord's Prayer. The bishop did forgive me. I feel like I'm a bad priest if I get this wrong. And she said, no, I mess it up like just when I'm in front of people, so I think you're okay, she said. But the thing that I actually learned about myself in that moment was that it was okay for me to die. I did not want to die. But I actually realized I had that moment of clarity where if this is it, I'm a Christian. I knew that. That's why I prayed the prayers and mixed them up. And I knew that, I don't know, I felt like that connection to the thing that all these people had taught me and all of the times I've taken communion. I had been fully incorporated, and now I was someone who could die. And I wasn't before. So I had been transformed by these people, by the old ladies in the rector's aid. Okay, they changed me. And it was only because all of these things had happened that there was a container for that. And it wasn't a program, although there was a program that I participated in. It wasn't a particular way of doing liturgy, although I participated in many liturgies. It was that the church had created a cohesive container for that transformation to happen. So they sent me actually away to seminary. But we don't always send people away to seminary, thank God. We tend to send people to places like their family or household. Like after brunch, many of us go to a place where there's people. have covenants. Right? We send people into those covenants. We send people into a civic sphere. And in the United States, that's a capitalist, pluralistic democracy. We send people to work. Most of us work for money in different ways and places and cultures of organizations. How are we preparing people here to do that the way we think Jesus would? We send people to church. Some people do get sent to seminary, or they get sent to the altar guild to prepare the table so that when we gather, there's something that we can use to eat, right? Some people are sent to church to do ministry. And some people are sent, I think I got this right, because this is new for me, hold on. Where's the creation? We've rearranged this a little since the last time. Creation. So we aren't just sent into the things that we recognize as the human social structures, but maybe a wider web of life that we're part of. All right, I think you said you had a story about how a person was sent by a church after they'd been transformed.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try and not cry about it because I love this person a lot. So, this actually happened here at the cathedral during convention that I'm referring to this story, but this is Miranda Brown, many of you may know her. She stood up, and she's a part of the cathedral here. She stood up at convention and asked some questions of the presenters at convention, and the questions she asked as she was preparing as a 17-year-old high-achieving, wonderful lady to go off to college was, what can she do or what should she do to prepare herself to enter a new church community when she goes to college? What should she think about doing so that she can be accepted and incorporated and all of these things into a new community? And the response that was given was wonderful, and it made me overwhelmed with emotion, because if you know Miranda, you know this is true. But the response was, just be the gift that this church has been praying for. You are the gift they have been praying for to go into this community. So I loved the reframe on that, because Miranda really is just doing everything all right. And really, it's like, what a wonderful moment to see that somebody would be able to get the gift of Miranda in the future. So,
Thank you. I'm curious if there are any other stories of hope where you saw the spirit in the way people were gathered, transformed, or sent. Maybe if anyone has one. You'll get bored if I talk all day. And I love to hear the stories of what's actually happening, what God's doing in a place. She's got a microphone. So what God does is powerful. That's why we want people to be a part of it. But when we talk in leadership meetings, how many of us have been on a BC or a vestry or served in one of those groups or an all leadership kind of? What do you, when you're in those rooms, spend most of your time talking about? Business. If it fell here, where would it fall? If you spend any time talking about these things, it's probably, we need more people so that our church can keep running, so that we can keep the doors open, right? And it's not, often it's not actually about this. It's about something else. It's about, now, I will say, I would argue we have to have a container. We need a container in the public square, we call that like the constitution of the government. And we need a container for our spiritual work together if it's deep and hard. And that's the practices we have in the congregation. But what we tend to talk about is how we're going to bring people in and make them like us. You want to argue with me?
No, I would never argue with you. Not about that argument.
Only over lunch in Free Squirrel Kitchen. And when we focus on gather, we tend to focus very tactically. And as transformed Christians, sent out into our context and coming back in, if we take the time to reflect on what it is that we have received and what it is we can bring back, how we approach gathering will be very different.
There's treasure that God put here, and it's the treasure of a place that has people and a memory. It's the treasure of a culture or a language. It's the treasure of actual resources that people are working to create or to reshape. It's in the ways that our wider community does things, which are honestly, they're about governance and comedy. They're about how we get along. So what I want to say here is that normally if you've taken the college, this is not the part we talk about the most. I've been a partisan in saying maybe we should talk about this part a little more. So now I have the chance to do that here with you. So you get to hear off what I really think, which is I am most compelled by when we send people out to prepared with discipleship tools to do this stuff. And I think if we do that, people here see us and they come want to be like us. That's what I actually think. Whatever our congregational ethos or mission is, what matters is what other people see. A lot of what we do is we talk about our in-group and the differences or similarities inside our church. When what the world asks of us is to attend to what's happening there. And there's enough difference inside our communities that we could just talk about that. We could just argue about how the Archbishop of Canterbury responds to allegations of sexual abuse. We could just talk about that and not do any of this other stuff. But I don't think that's what God wants us to do. So then when we think about the work we have to do of valuing our neighbors, I think this is a really useful framework for thinking about who our brave conversations ought to be with. So we heard actually last night that someone said the For Many One conversations were hardest here for some participants. So a wondering I have is, how do we equip families in our churches? How do we create a space where even in our households we could have those kind of conversations, particularly if everyone is coming to church? Because I'm wondering about that. Is it a conversation where some people aren't sharing some cultural artifacts? We send people out into a civic life or square, and I want to be clear too, I hear a lot, we don't talk about politics, or our job is to realize the vision of God. Like, we have some tension within our tradition, both in the American church and in the Anglican tradition. So if we think about the history here, like I happen to be one of those, Williams descendants, so I know boring stuff about Roger Williams and why the Baptists, until the 1950s, were stridently disestablishment. no, total separation of church and state. He argued it wasn't because the church would affect the state. He was worried the state was gonna mess with what we were trying to do. Say we can't offer sanctuary to homeless people. To say that we can't do the things the gospel demands. That's what he was concerned about. But we also have within our, and we're Calvinists, we have that in our tradition, but we also have we have Wilberforce. We have evangelical Anglicans who said, no, we can't just pray in church and then vote differently in the parliament. If I believe in church that every person is a human, I can't vote for slavery to continue. And this powerful social civic witness is born. When people say in churches, in our churches, we don't really preach about politics or we're not supposed to, I wonder what that means. How good of a job have we done at articulating what the church's role in the civic square is? Do we even know? Have we even decided as a community, or has one person decided? That's the part where our sending could be weak if we're not clear. I remember this great story from someone I heard who was in a big corporate church in Texas, and everything's bigger in Texas, but it was a downtown parish, and so they would have luncheons for the executives, and they would talk about Christian ethics in business. Now, like, that might sound like what, like, you know, but actually I thought that's really brilliant because it is harder for a rich person to get into heaven, according to the teaching. So they're going to need that help. And actually, there are people who have a lot of power in our society. Those people probably have a lot of power to influence the lives of other people. And wouldn't we want them to do that according to the way we think people should be treated? Church, I think we talk about. I think we're actually pretty good at sending people back into church. Here in the Northwest, we are not terrible at sending people back into creation to care for it. I actually think that's true regardless of political stance. We've had historically in Washington State, regardless of party, there's been a conservation ethos here, if you look at the history. I think that when we think about the brave conversations we have, we're talking about meeting people on hiking trails, we're talking about when we talk about church in places that aren't our church, and we're thinking about people who we work with, and we heard this at convention, who sometimes we have an opportunity to talk to them because of experiences we've had with them. Right? That's the kind of place where having the tools to have a Christian conversation, not just to win converts, but to help these people navigate this. Right? That's a thing we can do. So are there any questions or reflections about why I think this is really an important place to think about when we're trying to figure out where our energy should go in terms of bridging differences?
First of all, thank you. This has been really useful. In terms, and I'll, the caveat is I'm the creation care person at Resurrection. And I have to say, I do think there's room in the realm of creation for gathering people in, and we've been working on that and working on creating connections with the greater community for our garden. We've been working on thinking about recycling and how and composting, not so much recycling, but composting and how does that fit with God's creation and how can we spread that within the greater community. So while I think we're good at getting out into nature and loving nature, I think there's places for growth.
So maybe we haven't been transformed by it enough that we're cultivating it regularly. Yeah, I would take that. I think that's probably. Any other reflections or thoughts? I am particularly curious because there's some people who are pretty familiar with this model. What do you think?
So I think sometimes we think the goal is to get more people into the church. When think, from my perspective, the goal is to send people out to transform the world, not to get them into the pews. That's great if they come to
Birthday party.
you want to have something concrete to see for your neighbors, and transforming the world isn't necessarily a concrete, see. It works.
Well, I think that's a good point, because to me, when you start talking about consent, it sounds like a mission. And really, this is not, and this is one of the things that fell under, it's not part of this list.
Well, I would say
Different things.
every congregation, their mission is how they respond to this need for people to be transformed and be disciples in the world. Like, I can't be a disciple in the world unless I've been transformed in community. So the mission is every congregation figuring out in its particular context what it means to get people ready through Jesus practices for this work. Yes, Heather, and then,
In terms of what you were saying around civic life, sending people out into civic life, and that we don't talk about politics. I think what we've been trying to do as a diocese, not just here at the cathedral, but we've been trying to have this regularly in our sermons at the cathedral, is being really clear about what are our values, who is the Jesus that we follow, because we know that there are other perspectives all around us, and especially in North Idaho, which is not that far away from here, that have a radically different, that teach in a radically different way about who Jesus is, and therefore how we are supposed to be and follow. And so that part, it is politics because it's about the polis, it's about the people being gathered. And I do get, although I haven't recently, I think they just stopped, they gave up. I've gotten emails from some of my more conservative, probably Republican folks. Every once in a while I get a note from a libertarian, this is the place that has the most libertarians I've ever been in the community, from other places where I've lived. So that always surprises me. And it's like, we're actually not, this is, the things that we're talking about are not any political party's platform, it's Jesus's platform. It's the gospel, it's the core of the gospel message. And so I am with you that it is critical that in our churches we transform them so that they really know what Jesus' teachings are, so that when they go out, they can be informed in those ways of being. And it especially has to start with, as we shape our children in Sunday school, as we shape our youth, and on up.
thank you for that.
I sign on to the Do More with Send.
Yeah.
Co-sign.
Excellent. And just to be clear, electioneering, you shouldn't do. Candidates' names, political parties, you shouldn't be doing that. And from the pulpit particularly, it's just risky for the organization. We are allowed to take stances on things, though.
On issues.
Issues. If you've read the boring IRS ruling, it's like 100 pages, but it's worth a read if you want to go to sleep and learn more about the tax code. But you're allowed even to have some political stuff, but our tradition hasn't done that. We've valued, this is a part of our via media thing. We value being the place where you can have the disagreement. So we don't want to say no to the other stuff. We want to make it possible, but that means we don't take sides except for the moral and ethical obligations that the church, as its convention and bishops, decide. That's the stances that we take.
We try to make a distinction between being political, which inevitably the gospel is, because as Heather points out rightly, it is about the Polish, the community, and being partisan. The church is not and never will be partisan done right, because none of those elected officials are Jesus, right? But inevitably, if we are trying to follow in the footsteps of our Savior and feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the sick and in prison, and welcome the stranger, that is going to reflect political stances because we're anchored in our values. But that's why we've just been through the process of discernment for our budget going into the pledge season, and if you divide up the ways we spend our money on pastoral care and worship and all those things, the largest chunk of it is formation. Because we are seeking collectively to be formed and transformed into the image of God that we are created to be. And that includes being aware of what's going on in the world and understanding where to find the Holy Spirit in it.
Yeah, I bond that thing just kind of hitting over and over again. I think even going back into, Wilberforce, every people we do a section from, their formation, was by the church, but they use different language. Nelson Mandela, read his stuff and see that it's informed by the gospel. This whole conversation. And I've got that doctrine copy somewhere, cost of discipleship. I got when I was in college. I think that will be the first strand in our tradition. It's something we need to go back to.
So I want to shift gears here and think about our church and ourselves from a more social science lens. The Gather, Transform, Send model I wanted to talk about because we're a church and we have a mission.